Okay, well, I know a few people. Is your question one that you want to share with the group? Is your question a group question?
It has to do with what are we supposed to bring next week?
Oh. Okay. So for next week, I got some like cinnamon strudel bread stuff. So I'm going to bring that. I would encourage you, if you want to bring whatever. I would say probably don't bring a copious amount of things because we'll probably have enough. And don't plan on leaving it all with Father Keller because I don't want to be a balloon. But there are several things, like Deb brought caramels today, and you should know that caramels are one of my weak spots. Caramels, caramel rolls, banana bread, chocolate chip cookies. Her caramels were excellent. So if you're looking for Christmas caramels and you want to buy some, oh, she said that she didn't make them. If only there were more caramels in the world, it would be a better place.
But I think originally you had said something out of our tradition.
Oh, yeah, that would be, if you do have traditional foods that you have made, or you want to research one, that would be that's kind of fun to have things from different cultures. Remember in Spanish class in high school, I made potato pancakes. And those are very different. It turns out that despite what you think, if you mash potatoes and don't put anything in them, and you fry them, they actually work fairly well for different things. And so in Ecuador, they make these potato pancakes, and you use potatoes and put cheese in them, and then you fry them, and there's like no extra butter or cream, and they actually stick together very well. Like, they don't fall apart like you think they would. Now that I think of it, because this is just how things work, that would also make a lot of sense because potatoes are from Ecuador and Peru. That's where they're native to. Potatoes were a high mountain Andean plant that now grows in a bunch of places, but that's where they came from. Oh, they have another question.
We were talking about why historically is there so much anti-Semitism?
Why is there so much anti-Semitism? Part of it, I think, is just a puzzle. There are puzzles in history that you can't quite figure out. You can't just add up and say this is the reason why. Like, you look at all of the circumstances, or you look at the circumstances that we know, and it doesn't all make sense. Some of it, what you really see, and I've been thinking about this a lot, is that we think of Israel as being this sort of great nation, the city of Jerusalem, those kind of things. But realistically, Israel's not on the map. Like, not compared to great world empires. It doesn't have the same kind of arable land or protection that somewhere like Egypt does, right? Egypt is able to flourish partially because to get there, you have to cross hundreds of miles of desert. Well, it's not easy to cross hundreds of miles of desert with an army. And so by the time you get to fight the Egyptians, they're all happy and well fed, and you're sun-baked. When you look at ancient societies, there's many of them that flourish because of that. The United Kingdom is the same way. Why does the United Kingdom have one of the more organized polities in the Middle Ages and later? Why do they organize first? Well, a huge part of it is because they live on an island. And the English Channel is notoriously treacherous. Even in the modern world, there's still times where they don't sail across it all that much because the weather can be bad. And so in the ancient world, like that offers a lot of protection. When you have a giant sea around you that smacks every boat around and half the people die on the way, it's a lot easier to fight the armies. Now, it hasn't always saved them. I mean, there's things like the Norman conquest and different invasions of Britain, the Anglo-Saxon conquest earlier. But like Britain has a lot of protection. So some of it is that Israel is formed, and this covenant people of God is formed in a major crossroads of civilizations, where Asia meets Africa meets Europe. And those are always situations of tension. It's the same thing in the Balkans. Like that area of the world, there's lots of geopolitical tensions because it's a meeting between Europe and Asia. And based on the landforms, there are certain places where if you're moving an army, this is the way you're going. We're not used to that in North Dakota, but it's very true. Like if you go to Colorado, there's only a couple of places you can move large groups of people through those mountains. That's it. And it's either this one or that one. And otherwise, there's like this little tiny road that shoots over the top of that thing. And sure, you could do that, but it wouldn't be very smart. So landscape historically has a lot to do with it. Israel is caught between the major warring powers of the day, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Greeks. All of those different empires sort of move through Israel. Some of it is that the Israelites are a relatively stiff-necked people. I mean, that shows up in the scriptures. They're stubborn. They wrestle with God. They get into fights. They have debates. And that characteristic is a bit racial. There's a lack of integration. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing or someone should be persecuted for it, but it's just true. You look at the history, and lots of peoples in the world sort of figured out how to cope, and the people of Israel don't. I mean, you might wish they did, you might think they should, but they haven't. Integrating with wider society and different things. Some of it is because of the enshrined religiosity and the Pharisaical tendency that's in Orthodox Judaism, like the Pharisees that survive the fall of the temple. Jewish identity is rather strong and rather set in stone. So that's a part of it. There was a ton of historical animosity after the time of Jesus. After his death and resurrection, the Christians and the Jews are in a big fight that's a bit like a life or death struggle for both of them for several hundred years. And the scars of that we can feel. I mean, some of the things that were said last more or less until the Second Vatican Council and the Declaration on the Jewish People. Some of it is also that there are people that need scapegoats. I mean, it's very much, there's this sort of tragic reality that you want a fall guy. You always have someone to pick on, you always have someone to bully, and it's sad. It happens in schools, it happens in politics, it happens in all kinds of places. So that's a part of it. Some of it, especially in the Middle Ages, there are ways that were done and methods and kinds of thoughts that are a bit foreign to us as Christians, and society in the Middle Ages is a bit bizarre. But one of the things that happens is that Christians get prevented from charging interest because it's called usury. Our modern idea has changed somewhat, that charging interest per se isn't evil in and of itself. Charging excessive interest can be. But the biblical concern is taking advantage of those who are poor. And this is very true in our society today. So if you look at the difference right now, for instance, between a home loan and a payday loan, it would be very dramatic. But part of it that also happens in Judaism is the Jewish rabbis, the Jewish thought has this thing that you can't charge interest, but in the Jewish world, they interpret a lot of things as applying only to fellow Jews. So they read it not just as you can't charge interest, but you can't charge Jews interest. Well, that's a very different statement because there aren't a whole lot of Jews. And if you're living in Christian societies, which many of them were by the Middle Ages, you can charge all those wicked Christians interest. And this is part of what happens to enshrine Jewish bankers. Now again, it doesn't make persecution of them right. There's a history here, and it's a long history. Some of it, the scapegoating, the United States was discovered in some sense by Christopher Columbus and some of the expeditions from Ferdinand and Isabella. They were also rabid anti-Semites that converted Jews in the Spanish kingdom at the edge of the sword. It was convert or die. So there's that piece of it, because in Spain, Christianity was tied to national identity. And you could say that it was Christians, but in many senses, you'd be better off saying it was state. It was state power. It was state authority.
Question. So there's a lot of anti-Catholicism as well. But
There is.
how is anti-Semitism, because you never hear, oh, you can't be anti-Catholic, but you can't be
Anti-Semitic, yeah. So anti-Catholicism versus anti-Semitism. It's there. Like I said, there's challenges, and the history doesn't all add up. History itself is bloody and brutish and challenging. You can't fix it very easily. Are they like right outside our door doing something necessary? Anti-Catholicism, I mean, the challenge is that once a group becomes the majority, rightly or wrongly, it's sort of considered that you can't discriminate against them. I would say that's wrong, that discrimination shows up. Racism can show up in all kinds of forms. There's all kinds of racist speech you hear in North Dakota for Native Americans, and it goes in both directions. There's very, very racist Native Americans who think that all white people are trash. There's very, very racist white people that think that all Native Americans are trash. And it's just sort of a mess. It's this like, I think some of it you can't explain until you see the tendency toward wickedness in the human heart. You can't explain until you acknowledge that we just have this bent that's like against our brother. The story of Cain and Abel in the garden is very, very true. And those battle lines run, through our hearts today. Like, who is my brother? Am I my brother's keeper? And the answer should be, yes, we're part of a human family. Christianity and grace is very much an attempt to reinterpret and re-understand these things and to rely on the Lord and work on virtue and all of those things. So the story of anti-Semitism, I would say, is complex. I mean, some of it is hard to figure out unless you believe that Satan is out to destroy the Jewish people. It's just hard to figure out without that. But does that mean that the Jewish people are more chosen or more special than everyone else on earth? I think that with St. Paul, the scriptures would argue no. The New Testament, St. Paul would argue no, that neither being Jew nor Greek counts as anything. It's not important. Like, how you were born isn't what determines who you are. Being part of the covenant family of God is a movement of faith. It's part of the faith of Abraham. It's following in the footsteps of Jesus. And that's not a matter of birth so much as a matter of life and how you live. So I guess, like a lot of things, the reason why I point to so many different pieces of this is that it's complex, and we have to be careful, I think, about reductionism, of trying to reduce things to, here is a problem, here is the solution to the problem, and it's nice and orderly and fits in a box. Life is rarely like that. It'd be nice if it was, but it just doesn't work all that well. There's all kinds of situations and problems that you encounter that don't fit into nice molds, that don't fit into nice, easy boxes with easy answers. And there's many different problems where the solutions to them can be varied. I mean, if you look at the problem in the United States right now of illegal immigration, that's a problem. Now, how you solve that problem and what's at stake in it and what is required and what is asked and what is just and what is charitable, people of good faith can disagree on. I think you can take that in different directions. But the problem is complex. And part of the problem is because of American drug use. I mean, like a huge piece of the immigration problem is because of American drug use. Well, what do I mean? It's that you have this huge market for extremely expensive substances that's financing narco wars and financing the gangs. If there was no demand for the drugs, if the demand for the drug trade dried out and there wasn't as much money in them, they probably wouldn't do it. If they stopped killing each other all the time, then many of these countries wouldn't be so bad to live in. Much of the corruption that is part and parcel of the political society that they live in would lose its weight or would lose its connection to what they're doing. And if there was less corruption and there weren't as many people dying and they were able to get more economic engines going and not have to worry about protection all the time, then it's likely that the standard of living would improve. And if the standard of living improves, I mean, you see, like, you just start hitting a lever and all of a sudden, but very few people, I think, would ever stop to consider that a piece of the illegal immigration is related to American drug use. And I would argue without it, you can't understand Central America. If there were no market for narcotics, if there was no market for drugs, that whole region, everything south of our border would be different. That's not to say that something else wouldn't step in to fill the void. I mean, there's plenty of other problems than drugs in the world. But at the very least, like, there's a complexity to things that don't fit into nice and easy solutions. Native Americans and reservations are another one. I mean, you could actually argue in large happenstance that reservations are bad for the Native Americans. There's several tribes in places that don't have a reservation and are actually much better off because of it. And their kids are part of schools. There's a group in the cities that's crazy wealthy. They live in this enclave, and I think the average annual wage for them is in the millions because they own the rights to a couple of big casinos in the city's area. And they're a group of Native Americans, and their reservation is a tiny little strip of land that they planted a casino on, and that's it. They don't live there. Is that the solution? Probably not, but there's all kinds of things at stake in it. Are reservations a good thing? How do you preserve cultural heritage? What kind of cultural heritage is worth preserving? Is it a problem? Some of it could be biological. It does seem that people with Native American ancestry are they struggle with addiction to alcohol significantly more than people with European ancestry. And that's probably part of the European DNA, because the Europeans and that tradition was making alcoholic beverages for thousands of years, and our DNA adapted to it, and in the States they weren't. And so their DNA didn't adapt to alcohol present in the system. That's not to say that they're completely blameless in choosing it, or that, that those kind of things are not important, but just that, it's complex. There's no way around complexity sometimes. And the tendency we have to try and reduce things doesn't always work. I don't think you can point to, these are the 2 or 3 clean reasons why this is happening, and if we solve these, then we fix the problem. You might solve one problem that way, but lots of other ones can take their spot. I think it points to why morality is a struggle. Because in a way, the virtuous life means that you have to be virtuous everywhere at the same time. And you're either virtuous or you aren't. And if you aren't virtuous, then it causes problems everywhere at the same time. So, I don't think I could give a better answer than that. To dive into the book of Ruth, we were ending with the marriage of Boaz and Ruth. So Boaz claims this field of inheritance. He functions as a person that we would call a redeemer, who redeems Ruth, who redeems Naomi. And there's a beautiful connection in the Christian language to Jesus as the Redeemer, who purchases us, who chooses us as his people. It's very much cast in this light of Boaz. I think it shows us that the situation is more dire than it first appears. The way that we read this in modern English doesn't convey the full weight of what's going on very well, because you don't think of Boaz buying Ruth. At least I don't think of that when you just are reading through it and you hear the story. But if you look carefully, it does seem to indicate that he's buying Ruth, that Ruth is being sold as a slave. And this is a real redemption. So part of the story is this movement from slavery to queenship, right? That she becomes I think Ruth would be the grandmother of David, or the great-grandmother of David. Boaz and Ruth, Obed, Jesse, David. The great-grandmother of David. So she becomes like a matriarch. She becomes, like we talked about last time, this Jewish blessing, may you be like Rachel and Leah, a mother of the people of Israel. So there's this, that's one of the age-old tropes, you could say, of literature, is the story of riches to poverty or poverty to riches. And in this case, the riches that it's talking about could be financial, but in some ways it's much more about the spirit. It's much more about the heart. That the riches that they're talking about is living in the heart of the covenant, is having a good husband, being part of a good family, having people around you to care for you and to love you. The elders of the village of Bethlehem invoke a blessing for Boaz and Ruth. They give them this kind of blessing, and I don't really know what to think about this, because they talk about being like Perez and Judah. Well, Perez and Judah is the father of the tribe. But Judah became the father of Perez by Tamar, who was a prostitute. Like, again, the story isn't really a clean one. And so it's sort of like, how much of a blessing is that? May you be like Judah and Perez. I don't think you'd want that for your kids. Like, now, if it happens, you love them and you work with them through it, it's true. But it's sort of like, huh. Even Rachel and Leah, I think they're both wives of Jacob. And again, it's kind of odd. It's like, may you be like polygamists. So Ruth becomes Boaz's wife, and she bears a son. And this is one of the funnier pieces of the story, I think, because Boaz and Ruth have a son. Naomi, it goes from this bitter person to blessing. It's this transition from bitterness to blessing. The dry land of the desert is blossoming again. So Naomi decides that she is going to be the nurse of the son. Grandma's taken over. See ya, Mom. Goodbye. You can come back in time. Now, people in the ancient world, they were more comfortable with this idea of nursing someone else's child. That very much shows up, I think, even into Elizabethan and Victorian England. You find people that had nurses for their kids. But it is sort of funny in the story that, like, Boaz and Ruth are happily married and they have this son, and in comes Grandma again and pushes husband and wife out of the way. And like, Grandma's in charge. See you later. Grandma gets to be happy again. You guys, who knows about you? Obed becomes the father of Jesse, the father of David the king. Now, part of this is probably made easier because remember, they live in a society where they're more connected to each other. So it's very, very likely that they share the same house, if not the same bedroom or sleeping room. I mean, remember again, like this modern thing that everyone has separate bedrooms in a big house. Many of our houses are the size of palaces in this time of history. So if you think your house isn't very big or isn't very nice, if you look at it historically, you live in a mansion that's among the wealthiest upper crust that has ever existed. And even, I remember going into this summer, we went to a place called Lyndhurst, which is one of these mansions north of New York City built by the barons of Wall Street. Not always very nice people, right? But they had this summer home or this summer cottage that they would sail to on their yacht up the Hudson River. And it was a big yacht. It was like 100 feet long or something. But the house, I mean, it was a nice house, but it wasn't, compared to what you would think of seeing today, it wasn't extravagant. It only had like 2 bathrooms in the thing. And most of those were added later. It makes me wonder if people in that time, and that was like, 1930s United States. It makes me wonder if they had bladders. Because, like, I mean, there were probably like 20 or 30 people living around this house and in the environs, but they had all their servants and all the people that took care of things, and there's like 2 bathrooms for 30 people. You know, there's some things that I just like not knowing. So if your house has a nice bathroom, just know that it's a very good thing to have. So some concluding notes about this book, and I think these speak to a lot of different things. Naomi brings her daughters into a family circle. This is very much a book of family ties. of tying people together. What makes someone part of a family and what makes someone on the outside? So Naomi is very much concerned about her daughters and their role in her family. And the beautiful part of the story is the connection and disconnection between Naomi and Ruth. That Ruth is sort of family, but only family by building a bridge across a ways. Like, she would be an in-law for someone who has died and, not really connected to Naomi. But it's a story of the forming of a family bond that Naomi rejoices in, seemingly more than she rejoiced in her husband and her son, her earlier son. And that this relationship becomes very close, that family is something that stays close, that sticks together. A part of the story, I wonder if I have that somewhere else. A part of the story, I think, is really Naomi getting lost in bitterness. That's something that we have to be very careful of. It's easy to get consumed by bitterness. It's easy to become consumed by depression and loneliness. It has a tendency to take over and start eating things. And this is very much what happens to Naomi. That when things go wrong, and lots of things do go wrong in her life and things are difficult, that's true. But it's also true that she gets lost in bitterness. And she probably doesn't want to be around people. Even when she goes back to Israel, she's like, well, just leave me because my whole life is ruined and nothing is ever going to be good again. That's the same kind of speech that you hear when people are struggling or facing the difficulty of depression. I think that the book points to some of the ways out of it are some of these close family relationships, relying on the people around you. Getting out of the house is important, taking care of basics, food, shelter, sleep. And sometimes you have to work against yourself. You have to work against your feelings. Because when you're in a place of difficulty, the thought of, well, I could go do that, the difficulty or the darkness tends to shoot it down. Oh, it's not going to work. Oh, it's too much work. Oh, it's too cold outside. It's too hard. You're not really going to enjoy it. There's grouchy people there. On and on and on. It's all the same voice. Part of the message of the human person is just that voice becomes consuming. And it's not accurate. One of the great things that psychology talks about when people are suffering from depression is you have to play this game with them quite often a little bit, where it's like you feel like you're not going to enjoy something. Why don't you try it and tell me how it goes? And very often if they say, well, like on a scale of 1 to 10, it's just going to be a 2. If people go out, they might find out that, well, it wasn't perfect, but maybe it was a 4 or a 5. And you have to start learning to